Chapter 19. Dare awoke in a bushel of blankets. They were soft, warm, and hugging her. Outside, bugs were humming and it was dark. Several candles were burning in the tent, and the cool air blowing in through the mesh wall touched her cheeks. She inhaled and flinched, expecting pain that was no longer there. No, she told herself, there was still some, but it was so much less. A headache, mostly. The physician sat in the tent's open entrance, a mug in hand. His skin was pale in the full moonlight, and his voice was drawn. "You've missed time." She tried to lift a trembling arm. It was as heavy as an anvil. "Am I?" "You are well, child." He took a long sip. "You didn't yet understand what they had done to you. You didn't even feel the pain." "I could definitely feel it." He shook his head. "No, not since you had no idea how you were dying. The acid had numbed what could have been pain beyond your imagination. It was extensive. However, I am competent." He took another drink. "I also removed your scars." She rested back on the cot, frowning. "Even the one I got when I chased that bear? And when I say chased, well, it was about half and half." Pano rolled his eyes. "I don't understand how you warriors can be so attached to them. They're so ugly." Because they are what didn't kill us?" Her head was spinning and felt like a large hoof had trod on it. But he'd called her a warrior, and she smiled at that. "Elvish skin doesn't scar except in rare circumstances. You're part elf, so that helped. You shouldn't suffer from poor eyesight or pain in your bones until you are very old." He snorted into his mug. "If you live that long." "Huh?" She rubbed her arms again. They were smooth to the touch. "It's just that—" "Are you questioning my work?" She shrugged. "The other elf couldn't do much." "The one who had the bastard child?" He sniffed. "She was no healer. I am a master. Do you understand the difference?" She shrugged again. "All right, I guess that's that. Anything else, oh master?" He set down the mug on a small table. "I also gave you our language, which you should have already known. It will, however, take your mouth time to learn the correct pronunciation." "What?" She blinked, and then blinked again. "I know Elvish?" "In what language do you think we're conversing?" Dare was too dumbfounded to respond. She dropped her head into her hands. She was convinced it would roll off. It seemed to throb more now that everything else didn't ache. She sat up, but almost lost her balance in a rush of dizziness. "Lie down, child, you still need your rest." She clung to her forehead. "What?" She swallowed and tried again. "Why does it hurt?" Her voice was a croak. "Getting worse." "Drink this." He rose and set a small water skin on the edge of the cot. "You'll feel better. Not well, but better." "Healing's not supposed to hurt." She sipped the cool, sweet water. "You'll find it often hurts more as you heal." He sat down on the opposite cot. Shadows rimmed his eyes. "Your head feels pain because it learned so much so fast. The rest of you will be sore because I had to scour your body, like cleaning rust out of a pot. The Kelin are damned thorough when they decide to damage someone." He clicked his tongue against the roof of his mouth. "Never you mind. I shall send for something for you to eat." "No." "No!" He snapped, sounding much more as he did when she first met him. "Girl, you have to eat." "Don't send for it." She managed to swing her legs over the lip of the cot. "I'll get it." She struggled to snatch her boots as she watched them blur in her sight. "Don't come back here for scraped knees when you fall." "Thank you." She staggered for the tent's exit. Once outside, she leaned against a tree, her boots hanging in one hand. Her vision still wasn't steady. She took a moment to put on her footwear and then picked herself back up. She moved in a calculated lurch to the next tree. Her feet slipped and squelched in the mud, and she rested against the trunk for balance. When she windmilled into the cooking area, she collapsed over Kelin. She slapped her chest in an attempt to point to herself. She paused to make sure she was speaking common. Food. She thought in Elvish and had to translate into common. She could think in another language. Then she realized she could read it too. Symbols flashed across her mind. Elvish had a complicated writing system, an alphabet of 40-some letters and a separate syllabary. She didn't even know what a syllabary was. It made her head pound all the more. You look like the Walking Dead, Dare. Kelin leaned away from her. Are you all right? Better'n ever, she mumbled. Dare! Thalon dropped his dish and dashed over. You're better? She nodded. He wrapped his arms around her. She ruffled his hair and smiled, feeling comforted by a familiar face. And it surprised her how familiar the boy seemed, especially because she'd met him only a day before the elves. She bent down and returned the hug. You seem more alive, a sweet voice called. Dare looked up to see the cook gliding toward them with a steaming bowl in her hands. She proffered the dish. You and Kelin take your time to eat. You too, Thalon. Dare stared at the cook and nearly forgot to accept the bowl. Up close, this woman was too beautiful. She coughed out, Great, thank you. She sagged, and the cook nodded before disappearing back toward the fires. Kelin scooped up the dish in one hand and helped Dare with the other. How do you feel? Bad, she managed. Ah. He grinned. She collapsed like a foal with unsure legs. There were a few others already eating in the area. She recognized the Duke, but not the other elves. They weren't sitting near them, and no one glanced in their direction. Kelin sat beside Dare and stuck a spoon in his mouth. Sweet poems spring to mind. I wouldn't be upset if the Kelin killed us now, so long as I'm still eatin'. Dare dipped her spoon and tried it. The taste certainly delivers on the scent's promise. Thalon nodded and dug into his own dish. She sighed, staring at her stew. So, I think Caleb, the prince, is all right somewhere. I think they'd be angrier if he weren't. Kelin frowned. I hope. But they're elves, Dare. They're not going to act like us. She shrugged. Of course, this may also explain why you're such a freak on occasion. What? He pointed to her ear. Beside them, Thalon tapped his own and half-smiled. So you're like me? She shook her head. It's not my fault. Kelin closed his eyes. I can see it, too. Your mother? She is the most handsome woman in Riversbridge. In the whole county. She punched him in the shoulder. Ow, why are you angry at me? What, stop staring at me. It's not like I think about your mother. I'm just saying I think she is part elf. He rammed another spoonful into his mouth. She was left frowning. Yeah, maybe, but you'll learn that you won't get sick as easily, you'll heal better, and live longer. How is that bad? A towering voice passed over their heads. They looked up to see the immense form of the Knight Captain. Well, I am human, Dare said. I grew up being human. Yeah, tell me about it. He took a seat beside them. Elves are weird. The three of them took turns staring at him and then each other. Dare marshaled her words. You're one of them. He laughed, and it was deep and rich. Noticed that all by yourself, did you? Yes. You may call me Sir. That sounds just like my dad, Thalon commented. Fine, she replied evenly. You're too normal, sir. His face lit up with a grin. I don't know whether to be insulted or not. I'm anything but normal, especially by elven standards. That's it. She nodded. So why are you an outsider too? His grin slid into a more cautious expression. I'm not from Indaleria. She frowned up at him and narrowed her eyes. Why should I tell you? He inquired when she didn't release her stare. Because I asked. Kelin coughed into his hand. No. But the captain chuckled. All right, since you asked. I was born to the nomadic elves of the north. Way north. I joined the warrior ranks at a tender age, not by choice, and I was forced to kill people who had done me no wrong. Dare's eyes widened. Damn. Yeah, so next time don't ask. She shifted her weight and shoveled some stew into her mouth. Kelin took another bite and exclaimed as he chewed, Elves aren't nomadic. I heard that they build cities and huge legendary palaces. The knight chuckled. Out of the four of us, who do you think knows more about elves? You, sir, he ceded. Oh, don't let him bully you. The cook smiled as she arrived on velvet feet. She glided into a seat next to Thalon. This food is wonderful, my lady, Kelin exclaimed. You helped make it? Yes, well, it's incredible. He grinned and nearly overturned his bowl. Her hand snapped out and corrected his dish. Then don't feed it to the ground. Jacob grinned. You know, my lady, that's usually the reaction soldiers have to your food. It was yours too, I recall. He cleared his throat. In my defense, it is amazing food. Then he turned to Dare. So, Derora, what do you think? She narrowed her eyes. I'm wondering why the camp cook was at our trial. He sighed. I meant about the food, kid. Oh. Thalon finished his supper. He looked up to the cook and said, Thank you. You are welcome. She smiled. Kelin stared down onto his bowl. Dare's not wrong, though. No offense, my lady, but why were you there? Jacob leaned in and put a hand up to his mouth. Because she might not cook for us if we didn't indulge her a little bit. Dare stared at him with a flat face and one eyebrow raised. The cook chuckled with the tinkle of bells. I know our ways must seem strange to you, but please, call me Evelyn, or Lady Eve if you insist. Does that help? Dare did not relinquish the raised eyebrow. Yes, my lady. It is an honor to know your name. Kelin bowed slightly. Now we're becoming friends. Her smile melted their defenses. I'm curious. Is common the only language you know? Kelin bobbed his head. Yes, it is. Beside him, Dare shrugged and nodded. Times have changed, haven't they? She nodded to Jacob. Our captain here grew up speaking a mix of languages, and I remember having to teach him his own tongue. Jacob stiffened. Guilt flashed across her face for a fleeting moment. I also remember when each little kingdom had its own language. It's certainly easier to speak with them now. My grandmother spoke Common, Dare stated. I met her once when she visited when I was a child. The cook laughed and shook her head. I'm talking about the last of the Chentham Wars, dear. That was before your grandmother's time, I'm sure. It depends, the knight mused. One of her grandparents was quarter elven. Not the wars, of course, but they live longer. But those wars ended 2,000 years ago, Kelin protested. It's because of the wars that Common was invented, Jacob said. Well, forced into existence. And too quickly to be easily learned, in my opinion. Pearls is still used a lot too, I think. Pauls? Dare repeated, then thought, the language of Palins. The cook's eyes faded to focus on a distant destination. I wonder what the world would have been like today if Palins had not been slain. Kelin coughed. You're referring to King Maiden being killed by the Black Hound, right? Correct, the cook replied. So why do we speak common instead of something else? Dare asked. Lady Eve smiled. Most races speak their own tongues, as you know, but humans had no unified language. You mean there aren't other languages between the elves? Kelin inquired. Lady Eve shrugged. There are dialects, but it's not too removed from the usual. But back then, everyone needed to communicate. All the races, and all the different tongues within them. Pals was the medium for a long time, but along with it was the shadow of Palins, and some people felt in using it that they were submitting to the Empire. Thus, common came to be. She smiled. It hasn't been allowed to change either, unlike many other tongues. It has to remain stable because if it changes, we would lose the wide communication path between all peoples. Sometimes, like your antecedents, people just kept on speaking it instead of their mother tongue. That's incredible, Kelin breathed. Yes, the cook grinned, standing. Thank you for listening. It's pleasant to find humans who will hear their own history without argument. Kelin blushed and stammered his thanks. Fallon held up his bowl. More, please. Of course. She took the child's hand. Come with me. She paused and looked at Dare, and her bejeweled eyes unfocused. I wish you could have met my son. He was just a little older than you when... Well, I'm sure you would have gotten along famously. Or died trying to, anyway. She led Fallon as they retreated toward the cooking fires. Dare tensed to stand. What? Sometimes she says things, Jacob interrupted. He stared ahead at the fires. Even she doesn't know what they mean. Don't worry about it. Her frown deepened. But... Derora! His voice creaked warningly. She sighed and picked up her spoon. Jacob shrugged. There's a lot more history to the languages. Kelin started. Are you a soldier or a scholar? He chuckled. Do you want war stories instead? Yes, Dare blurted, a little more enthusiastically than she intended. Maybe later. The elf laughed. Since they want war stories, why not tell them about the one they're in? A deeper voice slid out of the shadows. Sir Amthros stepped into the light. Jacob dropped into Elvish. Where have you been? Dare stared at the ground, trying to keep her face blank. The other knight indicated behind them. Attending the horses. Jacob switched to common as he looked back at the villagers and asked, What do you know about this war already? Not much, Dare replied. The king and queen are dead. Caleb said they murdered his parents, and if he's the prince... Amthros nodded and sighed. Yes, a tragedy that we cannot fully comprehend. That's why everyone fled Long-Range Palace. Kelin squeaked. The Long-Range Palace? I've heard so many tales. Amthros's face darkened. None like this. Dare leaned forward into the ensuing silence. I only know the Song of Mendelin. That's the one where the prince dies, right? Jacob nodded. Yes, but it's more story than fact. And, with the way things are happening, let's not talk about dying princes. He turned back to Kelin. Yes, Kelin, Long-Range was magically guarded, and despite that, the Kemen invaded it. He frowned down at his bowl. Amthros bowed his head. That was our most sacred ground, and they defiled it with ease. Do you comprehend how impossible that is? The villagers shook their heads. He sighed. It would be hard to explain. Besides, it isn't your concern. He stood. Pray excuse me. I have other duties. He nodded to them and departed. Without anything to say, they returned to eating. But behind them, the elvish conversation among the Duke and his entourage had risen to new levels. Dare looked up at Jacob. So, well, why don't you take the palace back? The other discussion froze. Jacob shook his head. Hush, Derora. You're not running this war." He glanced at the Duke across the way. He spoke in a low voice. "It's not that simple." "I realize, but—" Farallon snapped off a loud comment in Elvish to the people around him. Then they all glared at the four of them. Dare growled in her throat. "Captain, they're talking about us." She immediately added, "They have to be. I mean, after all, we can't understand them. So what are they saying?" Jacob set down his bowl. "They're calling you typical humans. That means ignorant or stupid, depending on their mood. You fell for the Kelin ruse. You didn't know you're part elf, and he's calling me a fool for explaining things to you." Dare tensed to rise, but Jacob's massive hand slammed down on her shoulder. Food sprayed all over her face and shirt. She blinked in surprise, wiping a mushroom off her eyelid. The knight remained looking at his own bowl and pulled his hand back. "Learn to fight better first, and then learn when to fight." She felt Kelin staring at her. His eyes were wide. "What?" she hissed at him. He glanced between her and the knight. "You're not—" She rubbed her shoulder. "I think he'll break something if I try it again." Jacob snickered and picked up his bowl. She leaned over and whispered in conspiratorial levels, "So we have to take him out first." The knight grinned. "Just try it." "Kelin, you're getting along with the cook. I need you to give everyone food That's it," Jacob interrupted. "Finish up, you've got chores to do." "We do?" Kelin asked, surprised. "Yes, I just need to go and find out what they are." He didn't move to stand yet, but instead attacked his bowl with his spoon. Kelin smacked Dare on the arm. "Thanks for that." He scowled. "You know he is not letting you get away with your tricks." She stuffed more stew into her mouth. "What tricks? He can hear what we're saying." The captain pretended to ignore them. "Just what you do." But she wasn't watching him. Everything around them had gone quiet. She nodded ahead at the Duke, who was glowering at them. Kelin shivered. "No one believes us, or our story." Jacob shrugged. "They believe you believe it, at least." He set his spoon down. "You've only heard of the Kelin by legend and don't know the layers of deception they often involve." Dare stabbed her bowl with her spoon. I know what you think, kid." "Well, how did they set it up? We were never coerced or given orders." "Sir. How did they set it up, sir?" he corrected. "Sir." The knight captain grinned tightly. "I have no idea." He set his dish down. "Before you open your mouth again, it's time for me to go. Some of us have actual work to do. Don't think that I've forgotten about your extra chores." He nodded to them and left. "Thanks, Dare." Kelin rolled his eyes. She ignored him and chewed her meal, eyebrows narrowed in thought. "He interrupted me at least 3 times. Sometimes it's the only way to get a word in." She glared at him and then looked away. "I'm going to ask him if we can have our daggers." "That's enough!" Farallon spat in common. He stood and stalked toward them where he grabbed Dare's collar and hauled her to her feet. He pushed her all the way back to their tent, with Kelin and other elves dogging along on his heels. The Duke threw Dare inside and followed her in. She could feel the heat from his glare down at them. After a long silence, his voice dripped. "You disgust me." Dare glanced at Kelin, but Farallon snapped, "Not him, girl, you. He's just a regular human you dragged into this. You didn't even know what you are. Part elf, indeed. You were captured aiding a Kelin child. And now you're laughing and making jokes and asking for a suitable weapon as if nothing's wrong." "A dagger's more of a tool," she replied conversationally. His dark eyes flashed like lightning. "You correct me? You can't speak back to me. You were tortured by the Kelin, and still you understand nothing." She sat there, listening, and stared up at the Duke with a cool gaze. Then again, how could you? The sneer on his face almost made him look human. He flared his nostrils. You can barely fight off a mortal, so how did you face the Kelin? You're a mistake. A fluke. I should send you away. Oh, they'll find and kill you, but you won't be my problem anymore. Dare punched him in the nose. She didn't hint at her intentions or reveal any tenseness. She just landed a solid strike. Kelin gasped and half stumbled, half rolled away from her. The Duke yelped, more out of surprise than anything. He grabbed his face as he staggered back out of the tent. The cook and the night captain came running, with Thalin doing his best to keep up. Several other watching elves pressed closer. The Duke pointed. She attacked me! He inspected his nose with a gentle prod of his finger. She broke it. His voice was dull and simple. He sounded as if he didn't believe it happened. The captain glanced over at Dare, who was sitting cross-legged with her hands in her lap, trying to smother any expression. Farallon whirled back toward her. I will throw you to the wolves for this! Sir? The captain's voice was as stiff as a stone column. They surrendered to me and are therefore prisoners of the Order of the Silver Dawn Dragoon Knights. They are under my charge, not yours. The Duke whipped his volcanic glare to the knight captain. What? Jacob stared straight ahead. Any punishment to them must go through my order, and as the sole representative, that duty is mine. He took a deep breath. Sir, may I advise you to go see to your nose? I will see fit punishment delivered here. Farallon shook with anger. He hurled a fuming glare at Dare, but then stormed away. Lady Eve held a hand over her mouth, and her shoulders were shaking with suppressed laughter. Kelin looked as though he were melting. The rest of the elves followed the Duke with backward glares at the prisoners. Jacob turned his stern countenance toward Dare and approached. She scooted back. He reached out. Kelin winced. Dare's eyes widened. Jacob's hand extended, and he batted her nose. Dare went cross-eyed. That's it? The knight winked. Just for the love of all that is sacred in this world, don't do it again. Kelin scrambled forward. That's it? Jacob grinned, and Evelyn laughed aloud. He chuckled. I wish I could have seen it. The others smiled, a tad apprehensively. The captain shook his head, still grinning. Thalin ventured a chuckle. Can we have our daggers, sir? Dare asked. No. Kelin sagged. I can live with that, but I'm not sure if we can live with the Duke. Jacob nodded. I don't know what's going to happen next, but for now, just go to sleep. What about those extra chores? Dare inquired. The mirth on his face dissolved. I think the less of you seen tonight, the better. He ran a hand through his hair and whistled. I hope that there aren't any other surprises. Lady Eve shook her head with a half-smirk. I thought you knew better than to say such things. 2 hours later, shouts of alarm echoed throughout the camp. The elves ran to the edge of their campfire's lights. Dare, Kelin, and Thalin jumped out of their tent and raced with them. No one glanced at them, much less tried to stop them. Ahead of them, a figure had appeared like a ghost out of the blackness. He held up a sheathed sword away from his body. He dropped it. Dad! Thalin yelled and charged forward. Kelin grabbed him. The boy struggled, but Kelin scooped him off the ground. Archers lined up their arrows at the Kemen's chest. Jacob held a massive battle axe steadily. It was a double-headed axe with intricate inlay, and he had it on a short pole without a tremor in his arm. Dare realized that she couldn't recognize this Kemen as their savior. He was the same height as the others, and had the same dark hair, but she had never witnessed so much anger in anyone's eyes. It was definitely different than she'd seen with the other storm readers. It had to be him. His gaze rested on them and then on Thalon. He spoke. "My name is Thistle, and I've come for my son. In exchange, I bring you information. I am not the only traitor in this war. Who do you think sold out your king and queen?